There is a specific moment when you realize the effort isn't working, and you decide to increase the effort. That moment is the problem. Not what came before, not what comes after. That exact moment when logic says more and something deeper in you knows the equation is wrong. But you continue, because stopping feels like surrender. Daniel is going to talk about a mechanism, not about belief, not about faith, about a pattern of functioning that most people have never observed because they were too busy trying to change the result to notice what was producing the result. The mechanism has a simple name: compensation. Reality compensates. Always. And it doesn't compensate the way you imagine. When you force, it contracts. When you grasp, it slips. When you need something urgently, the object of that need pulls back. This is not a metaphor. It is an observable pattern. You have probably lived it dozens of times without naming it. The question is to understand why this happens, not to use that understanding as a new technique of force, because if you do, the mechanism will compensate again. The question is to understand deeply enough that the way you operate changes on its own. Think about how you breathe when you're calm. There is no instruction. There is no monitoring. The air comes in, the air goes out, and you don't consciously participate in any part of the process. Now try to breathe that way consciously. Try to replicate the fluidity of spontaneous breathing through deliberate intention. You can't. The more you try to reproduce the naturalness, the less natural it becomes. The breath starts to feel strange, stuck, mechanical. What was once automatic now requires effort. And the effort produces exactly what you were trying to avoid: tension. This is not coincidence. It is the structure of the mechanism. There are processes that function through the absence of conscious intervention. When you intervene, you don't improve them, you interrupt them. And then you realize they weren't working despite your not interfering. They were working because you weren't interfering. The law of invisible compensation begins here. Every action generates a reaction. That is the physics, you know. But there is a version of this principle that operates on a more subtle level, one that most people never perceive because it doesn't happen in the immediate physical world. It happens in the structure of the field where intention is formed. When you want something desperately, you are not merely desiring it. You are transmitting continuously and involuntarily a single piece of information. I don't have it. And reality, which responds to the internal state and not to conscious thought, organizes itself coherently with what you are transmitting. Not out of cruelty, out of coherence. A coherent system cannot respond differently from the signal it receives. If the signal is lack, the response is absence. If the signal is urgency, the response is resistance. If the signal is force, the response is counterforce. This does not depend on whether you deserve it or not. It doesn't depend on your goodness, your discipline, your dedication. It depends exclusively on the quality of the internal state from which you are operating. And here is the point most people never reach. The internal state is not what you declare. It is what you are while you declare it. Amara was 34 years old when she stopped trying in the way she knew how to try. It wasn't a philosophical decision. It was exhaustion. She was sitting at the kitchen table on a Tuesday afternoon, with a cup of coffee cooling between her fingers, and she realized she had planned, visualized, affirmed, and repeated the same set of intentions for 2 consecutive years. And the distance between where she was and where she wanted to be seemed, if anything, greater than when she started. She didn't put down the cup. She didn't cry. She simply stopped moving her fingers across the porcelain surface, which was what she did when she was thinking too hard. The fingers stopped. The mind stopped with them. For about 20 seconds, there was no plan. no analysis, no intention to change anything. She says that in that interval, for a reason she couldn't explain, she felt okay. Not happy, not fulfilled. Okay. As if the absence of effort was itself a way of being whole. 3 weeks later, a chain of events began to reorganize around what she had been trying to force for 2 years. She didn't create a new technique from that. She asked herself a different question. What exactly was happening in that moment when I stopped? Daniel is going to try to answer that question now. There is a distinction that is almost never made. The difference between intention and tension. Intention is a direction. It is clear, stable, and doesn't need constant energy to exist. You know where you want to go. That information is available, and it doesn't require you to repeat it every second to remain true. Tension is what happens when you don't trust that intention is enough. You start adding force. You start monitoring. You start checking progress with a frequency that, by itself, transmits doubt. And doubt is not merely a thought, it is a state that contaminates the field from which you operate. Most manifestation practices teach intention but produce tension, because they don't resolve the central problem, the internal state from which the intention is generated. You can formulate the most precise intention in the world. You can visualize it with absolute clarity. But if the internal state from which it emerges is anxiety, control, or lack, the intention will carry that signature. And it is that signature, not the words, not the image, not the declaration, that the field will process. The compensation mechanism works like this. Every attempt to force a specific result is also an implicit confirmation that the result does not exist now. And the more you confirm that absence, the more deeply it installs itself as operating reality. Not as a declared belief, as operating reality, the reality from which you act. An action that emerges from absence produces more absence. Not because reality is unjust, because it is coherent. Think of a musician playing with fear of making a mistake. Every note carries the tension of the imminent error. The body is partially contracted. The breath is slightly held. The attention is divided between what is being done and what could go wrong. And what happens? The mistakes increase. Not from incompetence, from state. Now think of that same musician in a moment when he forgets to be afraid, where the music simply flows because he is not monitoring, not evaluating himself, not trying to control the outcome. The notes come out with a precision that he himself can't explain afterward. He didn't become more technically skilled between one moment and the next. The state changed, and the state changed the result. Here is where the reasoning deepens, and where most people stop because the next part requires you to observe something uncomfortable. The tension with which you pursue results is not accidental. It serves a specific psychological function. It keeps an identity intact. There is a version of you that defines itself by what it doesn't yet have, that organizes itself around a narrative of effort, of seeking, of struggle. And that identity, that pattern of being, does not want to disappear, because disappearing is, from the perspective of that pattern, a form of death. Not literal death, the dissolution of a way of being that built an entire structure of meaning around not having and trying. When you approach a state of 0 point, of absence of forced identity, of absolute internal silence, that structure resists, produces thoughts, produces urgency, produces the sensation that if you stop trying, everything will collapse. That sensation is the self-preservation mechanism of the identity that is preventing you from changing. It is not weakness. It is structure, but a structure that can be observed. And when it is observed with sufficient precision, without judgment, without drama, without any attempt to correct it, it loses force. Conscious non-doing is not inertia. This is one of the most common misconceptions. When Daniel speaks of stopping forcing, he is not talking about stopping doing. He is talking about changing the state from which action emerges. There is an enormous difference between an action that is born from completeness and an action that is born from lack. Between a decision that emerges from clarity and a decision that emerges from anxiety. Between a movement that comes from internal alignment and a movement that comes from tension. The external result of these two forms of acting may be identical on the surface, but the quality is completely different, and the field each of these actions creates around itself is completely different. Action born from completeness doesn't need to prove anything, carries no defensive urgency. It simply moves in the direction that makes sense, and for that reason it meets less resistance. Not through magic, through coherence. It is not transmitting internal conflict at the same time it is trying to create externally. There is a concept Daniel calls the field of coherence. It is not an energetic field in the mystical sense. It is a structure of consistency between the internal state and the reality that organizes itself around that state. When the internal state is fragmented, when you want one thing but feel another, when you declare abundance but operate from scarcity, when you affirm confidence but act from fear, the field around you is incoherent. And in an incoherent field, the results are incoherent. Sometimes what you want appears. Sometimes it disappears. It seems random. It seems unfair. But it is not random. It is the exact mirror of the internal incoherence. When the internal state reaches a sufficient level of neutrality, not enthusiasm, not determination, neutrality, the field coheres. The internal fragmentation diminishes. And when fragmentation diminishes, the reality organizing itself around that state begins to reflect a different consistency. Not because you deserve more. Not because reality heard you. Because you stopped transmitting noise. The 0 point, the neutral field, the absence of forced identity, is not a state you reach once and maintain forever. It is a capacity that develops through repeated observation of your own mind. You cannot enter it through effort. That would be paradoxical, using tension to reach the absence of tension. You can only enter it by recognizing, with increasing precision, the moments when you have left it. And when you recognize you have left, that you have returned to the pattern of force, control, urgency, the recognition itself is already a partial return. It is not failure. It is the mechanism functioning. The practitioner is not the one who never leaves the neutral state. It is the one who learns to recognize each departure faster, until the interval between departure and return becomes so small that, functionally, coherence becomes the default operating state. Here is a paradox worth observing carefully. Most people use the understanding of the compensation mechanism to create a new form of force. Now that I know forcing doesn't work, I will make an effort to not force. This seems correct. It is not, because the attempt to not force, when it still emerges from a state of urgency or control, is merely force with different clothing. The mechanism recognizes the state, not the declared intention. You cannot perform neutrality. Reality does not process performance. Processes real state. This means the work is not learning to appear neutral. It is investigating what, specifically, keeps the internal state in tension. It is dismantling, layer by layer, the structures of identity that need the result to feel complete. Because as long as your identity needs the result to feel whole, as long as there is a version of you that only exists if that thing happens, you will continue transmitting lack. regardless of what you declare externally. The practical question is this: how does one dismantle an identity that operates through lack? Not through denial, not through the opposite affirmation, not through the belief substitution technique that most approaches propose. Through direct observation. When you observe a thought pattern without trying to correct it, without identifying with it, without fighting against it, something happens that doesn't happen when you try to change it. It becomes visible as a pattern. And when something becomes visible as a pattern, it loses its capacity to operate invisibly. Most patterns that produce internal tension survive through non-observation. They function in the background of mental processing, below the level of conscious attention, conditioning the state without you noticing they are doing so. When you bring them to the surface, not to judge them, not to eliminate them, simply to see them clearly, the structure begins to loosen. Not immediately, not dramatically, but really. There is a distinction between observing and analyzing that is central here. Analyzing is using the mind to understand the mind. It is a form of intellectual effort that can generate insights but rarely changes the operating state. Because the tool you are using to solve the problem is at the same level as the problem. Observing is different. It is a form of attention that does not participate in the content, that sees the thought without being the thought, that perceives the pattern without being inside the pattern. This capacity for observation, this minimal distance between you and the content of your mind, is what creates the space where real change happens. Not as an intellectual decision, a spontaneous reorganization. When the mind is being observed with this quality of attention, it naturally quiets. Not because you asked it to be quiet, because the act of observation suspends automatic processing. And in that interval, in that silence that was not manufactured but simply opened, the state begins to reorganize. The law of invisible compensation has a direction that works in favor of human experience, but only when you understand that the mechanism cannot be manipulated, can only be understood. When you stop forcing a specific result, you are not abandoning the result. You are stopping the transmission of the noise that was preventing the result from appearing. When you reach the absence of forced identity, you are not becoming passive. You are becoming coherent. And coherence attracts results in a way that effort can never imitate, because effort always carries its own contradiction inside itself. This is the central logical inversion. What appears to be surrender is, in the real structure of the mechanism, the position of greatest power. Not power over reality. Power of coherence with reality. Consider what happens when you stop trying to convince someone of something. Most people notice this in interpersonal relationships. When you argue with urgency, the other person resists. When you stop arguing not out of resignation, but because you genuinely stopped needing to convince, something in the dynamic changes. The other person frequently begins to move toward what you had stopped asking for. This is not a manipulation technique. It is the compensation mechanism operating in reverse. When you cease exerting force, the resistance that was created in response to your force loses its function. And without resistance to organize against, the system naturally seeks a new equilibrium. The same principle operates in every dimension of experience. In work, in creativity, in health, in the way the mind processes complex problems. The most elegant solutions rarely appear when you are forcing. They appear in the interval after the effort. In the moment you step away to do something else. In the threshold between sleep and waking. In those points of neutral field that occur naturally, and that, when consciously cultivated, become the environment where intelligence operates with greater precision. There is something Daniel calls layers of compensation, because the law does not operate only at the most obvious level. The first layer is the most visible. You force, reality resists. You stop forcing, something moves. Many people eventually perceive this. The second layer is more subtle. When you learn that stopping forcing works, you begin to stop forcing as a strategy. You use non-action as a tool of control. And the mechanism compensates again because the internal state is still control, even if the external action is one of release. The third layer is where most practices get stuck. You realize that non-action as strategy is also force, and so you try to reach genuine non-action. But the attempt to reach genuine non-action also carries intention of result, which is another form of force. This is the labyrinth. The exit is not to resolve the labyrinth on an intellectual level. It is to perceive that the labyrinth only exists while you are trying to exit it. When the urgency to leave disappears, not because you decided you no longer want to leave, but because the state that was creating the urgency dissipated, the labyrinth dismantles itself. Daniel is not saying you don't need to act. He is not saying external reality will reorganize regardless of what you do. He is not describing a state of passive beatitude where everything happens without participation. He is describing a different quality of action. Action that emerges from completeness has observable characteristics. It is precise, it goes where it needs to go without excess. It is efficient, it doesn't spend energy convincing itself that it is right. It is sustainable, it doesn't depend on peaks of motivation or willpower to continue. And it meets far less resistance in the external field, because it is not transmitting internal conflict. Action that emerges from tension has opposite characteristics. It is excessive, it goes beyond what is necessary because it needs to prove something. It is draining, it consumes more energy than it produces result. It is fragile. It collapses when results don't appear within the expected time frame. And it meets resistance proportional to the force it transmits. The distinction is not philosophical. It is functional. And you have probably experienced both states and already know at some level which one produces what. One of the places where this manifests most clearly is in decision-making under pressure. When you need an urgent answer, when the anxiety of not knowing is present, the quality of the decision you make from that state is consistently inferior to the decision you would make from a neutral field. Not because you became less intelligent, because urgency narrows the processing field. It reduces the available connections. It focuses the mind on a narrow band of options that seem relevant given the emotional state, and excludes precisely the possibilities that a broader state would see. Decisions made from urgency have a signature. They tend to resolve immediate tension while creating future tension, because the urgency was seeking relief from tension, not the best response. Decisions made from 0 point have a different signature. They are slower to appear but more stable when they do. And they tend to be coherent across a longer spectrum, because they were not generated by the pressure of the moment, but by the clarity of a more neutral state. What keeps people trapped in the cycle of force is not lack of knowledge. It is an implicit equation that most people have never examined. The equation is this: result equals validation equals existence. In simpler terms, unconsciously, many people operate as if the external result is necessary to confirm that they exist in a valid way. That success is proof of worth. That achievement is a condition of deserving. As long as this equation is operating, as long as the internal state is conditioned on the external result to feel whole, any absence of result will produce urgency. And urgency will produce force. And force will produce compensation. And compensation will produce more urgency. The cycle does not break through the arrival of the result. Because even when the result arrives, if the equation is still active, the structure simply moves to the next object of lack. You achieved that thing, and now you need the next one to feel valid again. The real break in the cycle happens when the equation is exposed. When you can observe with sufficient precision, I am seeking this as proof that I am enough. And the question that naturally arises from that observation, and that has the potential to reorganize everything, is, what if I am already enough before the result? Not as an affirmation, as a real investigation. That investigation is not emotional. It is not a self-esteem exercise. It is an observation of the functioning mechanism of identity. The identity you call I is, in large part, a set of processing patterns that consolidated over time. These patterns have preferences, fears, survival strategies. And one of the most fundamental patterns is the need for external confirmation to establish internal coherence. When that need becomes visible, not as judgment but as structural observation, it begins to lose its automaticity. You start to be able to operate without it, not because you eliminated it, but because you see it. And when you see it, you are no longer entirely it. There is something that is observing, which is not the observed pattern. That observation point, that internal position that is none of the patterns it observes, is the neutral field. It is what Daniel calls the absence of forced identity. Not the absence of who you are. The absence of what you are being as defense or as strategy. There is a form of clarity that only appears in that field. It is not clarity about what you should do. It is clarity about what is true, about what was already present and was not being perceived because urgency was occupying all the available attention space. When effort ceases not as a decision but as a state, what was being masked by the noise of effort begins to become audible. Information that was available but not registered. Patterns that were operating but not seen. Possibilities that existed but were not being considered because the state of urgency could only see a narrow band of reality. This is what Amara probably experienced in those 20 seconds at the kitchen table. Not a mystical revelation, a temporary suspension of the noise. And in the silence of that interval, something that was already organizing itself could finally become perceptible. The law of invisible compensation in its complete version has two directions. You already know the first. Force generates counterforce. Tension generates resistance. Lack generates absence. The second is less spoken of. When the internal state reaches sufficient coherence, when the fragmentation between who you are and what you seek diminishes to the point of no longer producing noise, the external reality begins to organize coherent responses in alignment with that new state. Not overnight, not dramatically, but consistently and over time undeniably. This is not magic. It is the same mechanism operating in the opposite direction. If tension generates resistance, coherence generates fluidity. If lack transmits absence, fullness transmits presence. If noise masks perception, silence allows it to expand. The neutral field is not the destination. It is the state from which real change becomes possible. Not because you did something right, but because you stopped doing what was preventing the system from moving. Daniel wants to be precise about what stopping forcing means in daily practice. It does not mean you cancel your intentions. It does not mean you abandon projects. It does not mean you become indifferent to what happens. It means you investigate continuously the state from which you are acting, that you develop the capacity to perceive when you are operating from tension, and to return, not through force but through recognition, to the field of coherence. It is a work of attention, of observing your own internal operation. not a practice in the conventional sense. A refinement of perception that, over time, changes the way you relate to the reality you are creating. You still act. You still move. You still make choices. But the quality of those actions begins to change, because the state from which they emerge begins to change. And here is what Daniel has observed in himself and in the people with whom he has worked through this investigation. The moment of greatest transformation is rarely dramatic. It is almost always silent. It is the instant when you stop needing that thing to happen in a specific way. When the urgency yields, not because you forced it to yield, but because something in you recognized that the urgency was costing more than it was protecting. It is the moment when the identity that organized itself around the search, that needed the result to feel complete for 1 second, dissolves. And in the interval of that dissolution, you perceive that something remains. Something that didn't need the result to exist. That recognition doesn't change everything at once. But it changes something fundamental. Because when you discover that you exist independently of the result, not as a concept but as a real experience, the relationship with the result changes. You can continue seeking, but now from a different state. A state that does not transmit lack. A state that does not create resistance proportional to its urgency. And it is from that state that the law of invisible compensation begins to work with you, and not against you. The estado nullo, the null state, emerged from the need to go beyond traditional manifestation techniques. It was created to help you understand and sustain that internal point of neutrality where effort disappears and reality begins to respond coherently. More than learning something new, it is a process of dismantling the identity that forces, allowing change to happen through alignment and not through tension. It is not obligatory. It is for those who feel that what was said here makes sense in a way that goes beyond the intellectual, that ignites a recognition of something you already knew but had not mapped with precision. It is a continuation of this investigation for those who want to go deeper. The link is in the pinned comment. You will not be able to use what was said here as a technique. If you try, the mechanism will compensate. You will be, once again, forcing only now with the language of non-forcing. What you can do is observe. Begin to notice in your own experience the moments when tension is present. The moments when urgency is distorting perception. The moments when identity is contracting around a result and transmitting exactly the signal that produces resistance. Not to correct, to see. Because what becomes visible with sufficient attention begins to lose power. And what loses power leaves space. And in the space that opens when force recedes, something you were trying to reach frequently finds its way back on its own. Not because you stopped wanting it, because you stopped blocking it. If something in this reasoning touched something specific in you, if a word or an internal state remained present while you were listening, write it here in the comments, your name and a single word. The word that describes what you felt or recognized. Can be silence, can be neutrality, can be surrender, can be coherence. One word is enough. Sometimes it is more than enough.